everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Gwyneth Mallon. I'm the director of the NYU Center for the Humanities, and I'm very pleased to welcome you all tonight. I want to thank Denny Valentin, Alexander Martinez, Janina Soriano, and Victor Bautista for their help planning and executing this evening's event. This event is part of our Digital Humanities series. Every semester through this series, we sponsor several evenings of conversations centered around cutting-edge scholarship and knowledge creation in all things digital humanities, that is. Tonight, we are here to talk about distracted reading, acts of attention in the age of the internet. And together, we're going to work through the theorization and the practice of modes of attention to think about how the state of hyperconnectivity that we're all inexplicably caught up in constantly impacts our research and our teaching. And to do that, we have 5 scholars joining us to discuss this timely topic. Marian Thane is the master architect behind this whole series, and I'm going to introduce her now and then turn the evening over to her. She's going to serve as your moderator and your guide this evening. Marian Thane is clinical professor of liberal studies. She is also in the English department as faculty member, and her title here is Associate Director of Digital Humanities. Her research areas are technology and the production of cultural knowledge, poetry and poetics, Victorianism, aestheticism, decadence, and modernism. She's taught many courses, and she continues to do so at the Liberal Studies program. She's published 5 books and many journals and articles and essays. She told me to be brief, so I'm not going to tell you all the titles, but you can speak with her afterwards about those. She's also led a number of major research projects, both here and in the UK. We're very fortunate to have Marian with us, directing our digital humanities. I'm going to turn the evening over to her. It's to you, Marian.
Thank you. Thanks very much to Gwyneth and to the rest of the team here at the Centre. It's been a pleasure working with you all, as always. I also want to thank very much Amanda Lewis, who I know is going to be here a little late because she's coming from another event. But Amanda Lewis and the Office for Educational Technology are not only co-sponsoring this event, but Amanda has also been a wonderful collaborator in getting these panels together. And I also want to thank all of you for coming out tonight to hear our panelists. And it's your energy and enthusiasm that makes the Centre such a vibrant place to be. And before I introduce tonight's speakers, I want to say a little bit more about the broader project of distracted reading. And this is going to end in an invitation for all of you to get involved with this project, actually, if you want to. So the premise of the Distracted Reading Project is this. Central to the humanities is the theorization and practice of modes of attention, to cultural artifacts and to other aspects of the world. And many of us devote much of our classroom time to finding ways to redirect our students' attention away from the distractions of their multiple electronic gadgets. But what if we not only instruct our students in more established scholarly acts of attention, but also consider how their distributed focus might enable new acts of attention and new ways of reading? How might we rethink pedagogy in an era of hyperconnectivity? And furthermore, how might these pedagogical experiments inspire new methods for our research? How might we think about pedagogically inspired research in addition to the more usual research-led pedagogy? Distracted reading is not a new thing. For example, at the start of the 20th century, the idea that poetry was in danger of becoming irrelevant to the modern world because the speed of modern life and its saturation with distractions was perceived to have the potential to destroy the capacity for attention that was necessary for reading linguistically dense and complex literary forms such as poems. So Ezra Pound, for example, asserted in the 1930s, the main expression of 19th century consciousness is in prose rather than poetry. He goes on, the art of popular success, for the writer, lies simply in never putting more on any one page than the most ordinary reader can lick off it in his normally rapid, half-attentive skim over. And I love that idea of sort of this licking of prose off the page, this rapid attention. So readers, in other words, according to Pound, were too distracted in this era of modernity, to be able to attend to the density of poetry and its play with sort of multiple and complex resonances. So according to this narrative, the novel won out over poetry over the second half of the 19th century because you could read the novel while you were distracted. And I'm sure this is an example from the early 20th century, thinking back over what had happened over the course of the 19th century. And there are, of course, many examples that go further back that reflect on the effect of the distractions that are posed by the new technologies of the age, whatever age that is, whether they're pre-digital or much earlier. But while distracted reading is not, we're not claiming is a new thing, I think it does have a new currency and a new relevance in our current moment, in part because of the interest in distributed cognition. What's called distributed cognition is a framework that psychologists are using for thinking about the way that cognitive processes are distributed across the body, across social groups, and across the electronic gadgets that have become, in a sense, extensions of our cognitive selves. So what happens if we take those ideas into our teaching? We might start to think about cognition as a social phenomenon in the classroom, and we might start to think about the relationship between the student and their electronic devices as modes of distributed cognition. We might, in other words, come to see distraction as a form of distributed attention. And I wanted this event to showcase and celebrate some of those in NYU and beyond who've been experimenting with pedagogy in ways that I think reflect this moment. And I hope this is something that might inspire all of us here to try something new, try something we've not tried before. And if tonight does inspire you, you can join this conversation going forward. There's going to be a special edition of the journal Digital Humanities Quarterly devoted to this project on distracted reading, and I'll be sending out a call for papers for that soon. If anybody wants to send something in to me, that would be great. And I think it's important also to say that we're thinking about distracted reading not just as an issue of textuality, we're thinking about sound and image too. And that multidisciplinarity is a very important part of the project. So it gives me great pleasure then to introduce you to tonight's speakers who come from right across the humanities disciplines. We've got a great spread across this panel. Constituting our first panel on sound and image, we have Jaime Oliver La Rosa from the music department at NYU. We have Marina Hassapopoulou from cinema studies at NYU. And Martha Hollander from the Department of Fine Art, Design and Art History at Hofstra University. In our second panel here, we have Ethna D from Writing Studies at Hofstra University, where she's also Associate Director of the Digital Research Center. And we have Suzanne England, who is from the School of Social Work at NYU. So in addition to our colleagues from NYU, it's a real pleasure to welcome our guests from Hofstra. Last year, Hofstra reached out to the digital humanities community in New York City and involved us in their exciting plans to develop their digital research center. And it's great to have the opportunity to really sort of cement that bond between our digital worlds by welcoming you here tonight. And just in case any of you missed this, Hofstra had a little event of its own last night. And we might perhaps later on get the chance to think about the centrality of modes of distraction to the performance that we saw at Hofstra in the debate last night. Anyway, I will pass over to Jaime first of all, who's going to start. You can all announce your titles, but Jamie's going to start by talking about music.
I was making a presentation and I got distracted, so I made this one. Because I thought a case study might be relevant. So I'm going to talk about how to hack, not how to hack, but what happens when you start hacking and repurposing video game cameras. And the case study is an instrument I made and the PlayStation Eye camera. So just a little bit of background. I studied music composition as when I first started doing music, and then I focused on computer music. And in computer music, your instrument is the element of distraction, right? So you can check your email or even watch television. I watch the worst television you can imagine while programming because it doesn't distract me, or I think that, right? You can hear a TV police program while working and not get distracted from programming, as opposed to the news where you do get distracted. I'm originally from Peru, and I'm very interested in how data moves around the world, and I've done some courses in hacking and repurposing at NYU with the help of Armanda. Actually, she's been fantastic, where we hack all sorts of toys and devices of any kind. And I realized while we were doing this that students tended to find apps to test all of these things on their phone, so they couldn't text while working in class. They couldn't, just because they were using it as part of their circuit, as part of their network. So that's my bit of background. So this is the device I'm talking about. It's the PlayStation Eye camera, and it came with this thing, and I'll just give you a sense of how it worked. That should have Okay, so that's the original device. And I realized while I saw my students engage with games, how I engaged with games myself, and how every kid in the, I guess, 90s wished, or 80s wished their controller was more sensitive. And I realized that video games are an education in gesture for everybody, right? That's how we learn to relate to our electronic devices through gesture, which is not how we relate to our TVs or radios or something, right? Video games have something special about gesture and action, and this is something that musicians are very interested, because the relationship between your movement and the image of your movement, or the image of the movement of someone else, that is gesture, to sound, informs us about sound. So the great things about this device were that it was USB, that it could do 120 frames per second, which was in 2007 when this was introduced, was a lot, and it allowed you for very low latency, so you would see a gesture and hear the result very fast and with very good resolution. It costed $45 in 2007, which was amazing, because anything that did 30 frames per second or above, well, more than 30 frames per second, would cost a lot more than $45. And regular USB webcams would only do 30 frames per second and have huge latencies. So now this camera costs $449 plus free shipping on orders of 49. So I've ordered more than 10 on several occasions. And there was a problem, though. This was a proprietary camera, right? Sony had made this for their video game, so they didn't want anybody else to use it. But there was this French hacker in the height of the tabletop controllers that made a driver that the community immediately jumped on and started using. So that led to creative work. So this is an instrument, or a controller, if you will, that I made in 2008. So this was right before the driver came out in 2009. And the first version, which is not this one, had a security camera. So I managed to find a analog security camera that, the ones you find on banks and stores, and the card that allows you to see the video. So let me show you a little bit about what I did with that. So this is the view of the camera and the kinds of analysis that the device can do. So here we go. let me jump to another section. Okay, so that was just to give you an idea of what I did with that. Immediately, as soon as I saw the video camera for the video game controller, the PlayStation controller, I realized that that this was perfect. So I found this driver and I upgraded my instrument and built a tutorial. And immediately I realized that not only was I taking advantage of the fact that the video game industry really looks for fine-grained gesture and for high-resolution gesture, but also of their distribution all over the world. So I had received a request to sell a drum, and I thought that would be awful because then I would have to be responsible if it failed. So I just put a tutorial on the web and explained how to do it, and that person built it. And after that, from this tutorial, things started happening which I didn't expect. So the first is appropriating these analog security cameras, and then finding this distribution and put the tutorial. And so this is a student in Canada that posted this thing on Facebook one day. And you can see he writes silent drum plus oscilloscope, oh yeah, and awesome. And suddenly there was this sort of social media not movement, but attention, sudden attention to this. So you cannot see the drum there, but you can see the he started graphing the outcome of playing the drum in one of my pieces and started playing with one of my pieces, which sort of automatically created a new version of a composition that I had made. Then in Brazil, a person decided to adapt an Ilu drum, which is from the Afro-Brazilian tradition. And so in a Carnaval construction, it's not a construction site, it's the wrong word, but the factory to make these drums, he got this frame, adapted the PS3 that you can see there, and started playing this in Afro-Brazilian ensembles and teaching young people to use drums. And so he managed to make the connection between video game controller, kids, computer music education, and also he used it as a statement between traditional music and new technology. So for him, this is a fork of my instrument, and a fork is a term from software, right? So it was a way of finding that transition. So let me show you this really fast. In Colombia, some person invented a different one and used a Kinect instead of a PS3, and he played. Oh, it's a little quiet, I think. Oh, I muted it, sorry. So used a different device altogether. He got rid of the actual body of the drum, so it's not a drum anymore, it's just a stretched piece of cloth. And then in Holland, someone made a dance piece based on the same principle. And so I got really interested in how this information was transmitted, right? So this is a dancer inside some sort of bed. And this was the first version that he made. So you get the idea. And this just came in last month from a student in Michigan. He made this thing and he calls it the box. And it's 2 drums. So a lot of really interesting properties of software and new media are transferred onto a semi-physical or semi-material device that is not just a piece of software, but it's also a physical object, right? And so, for example, this is an example of modularity. He uses this to make techno. The other people was Afro-Brazilian. The other one was experimental dance, and all these different aesthetic redirections of a tutorial. So, and all of them are based on either the PS3 or the Kinect. And so students see this and they immediately realize that the things they own are potentially repurposable, and they can use it to make music or to make any kind of electronic arts. So this has sort of allowed me to teach music now, not as a fixed art object, but as a navigable structure. And so the same kinds of structures you can have in a video game or in a virtual world can now be applied to compose music or to make musical spaces that students or performers or musicians can inhabit. So this is my current take on this. I have more stuff, but I think I did 10 minutes, which is the objective. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so this is actually going to be a very productive transition because I'm already seeing some overlaps. I'm going to talk about remixing as repurposing. And just a bit of background about myself. So as a cinema studies professor, I find that the most challenging courses to teach are those where students feel that they cannot contribute anything new or anything unique to existing discourses. For instance, in the areas of film history and theory, it's very hard to sort of encourage students to have their own sort of unique take on this sort of master discourses that we're dealing with. So today I'm going to focus on just one example of productively incorporating experimentation, crowdsourcing, social interaction, and collective intelligence into the learning process to generate new approaches to existing historical and theoretical frameworks in the analysis of sound and image from sort of a cinema studies perspective. So the thought for this assignment I'm going to talk about started with an issue. So in film and media studies, sound is usually analyzed in relation to moving images. In film theory, sound is mostly treated as an element that is completely dependent on the image. I wanted to challenge students to sort of reverse this relationship and interrogate this assumption and to inverse the typical hierarchy of image sound into that of sound image, with sound being at the forefront of their cinematic experience in order to propose different ways of analyzing acoustics in cinema and to use sort of collaborative sound design to create new narrative and intertextual layers. So reversing this conventional hierarchy of image sound into sound image can be very productive in terms of also considering how our minds and bodies attempt to make sense of multisensory synchronization in cinema, the different ways that the media we interact with on a daily basis sort of condition our sensory responses and often synchronize the senses, even if in this age of distracted attention. And furthermore, moving beyond ocular-centric paradigms of cinematic reception challenges our bodies to literally make sense of films using other modes of perception besides vision, or at least alongside the typical visual paradigms. So after teaching a class on sound theory, I challenged my grad students to spontaneously brainstorm to provide a new score for a transitional sound film from 1930 called Tomatoes Another Day, also goes by other titles like Tomatoes Another Day or It Never Happened. And the film itself is very reflexive on this transition from silent cinema to the talkies. And the narrative centers on a love triangle between a married couple and the wife's lover. I'm going to show you an excerpt The original film added more layers to our discussion on film acoustics because it reflects on the widespread anxiety caused by the introduction of synchronized sound in cinema and humorously parodies cliches associated with the first talkies, while also opening up new experimental possibilities for acoustic experimentation in cinema. So the objective of the class assignment was to add more interactivity to the already reflexive so-called original version of the film by treating Tomatoes Another Day as a remixable database. Students proposed several songs to use to rescore the film, and I assembled them just spontaneously in class into a YouTube playlist. And then we replayed the film on mute, and I layered the new crowdsourced soundtrack alongside the muted version of the film, with students giving me cues whenever they wanted me to switch to the next track. And I'll show you just an excerpt right now. And this is from videos that some of the students took during the screening, so they were just multitasking to the extreme. And I kept, because you can see sort of the collective reactions as I'm playing. I'm going to skip over some parts because it's a bit long. But those sort of formulate part of this participatory social experience.
You're cheating hard to find someday and crave the love is threw away. The time will come when you'll be blue.
Oh my god, cheers. Let's get some shifts. Let's get some shifts. Let's get some shifts. Let's get some shifts. Shiz. Shiz. Oh my god, shiz. These shiz rule. These shiz suck. These shiz rule. These shiz suck. Shiz. 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 Oh my god, shiz. These shiz rule. These shiz suck. These shiz suck.
Okay. There's more to that. I just upload all my experiments on my Critical Commons profile. But I just wanted to also encapsulate some of the sort of collective reactions to this spontaneous experience. And we actually got some unexpected resynchronization between image and sound. So it felt as though it was more premeditated than it was. And while usually remix practices are associated with context collapse, I wanted students to alternatively explore remixing as an active act of reflexive recontextualization and as a process of building new connections between the old and the new methodologically, historically, theoretically, and so on. So thinking of remix as an active mode of critical engagement with audiovisual texts. This process requires familiarity with the contexts that are being remixed in the first place. So if you watch the entire clips, you'll see that the different sound clips that the students picked are not arbitrary. They demonstrate familiarity with the narrative, for instance, with the love triangle in the film, and more than that, familiarity with the film's historical and technological context, as well as with the fluctuating dynamic between aesthetics and acoustics in the original film. So in addition, the resulting remix indicates the students' collective ability to think of narrative as a combination of elements in a potentially endlessly remixable database and recombinatory narratives. something which is consistent with the logic of the various media they interact with on a daily basis. So to them, I felt like that they're more naturally inclined to approach narrative from this sort of deconstructive and reconstructive point of view. And through this exercise, it became even more obvious to me that many students, particularly those immersed in digital and social media, tend to think hypertextually and in multi-focused ways. So from distracted to sort of distributed modes of attention. And since this exercise was popular in the class, we tried a second, more organized attempt by using a different film, this time an early silent film. And this time students had more time to collectively brainstorm on picking the sound clips for the new soundtrack through online discussions. And then I assembled their choices. You can see some of the media that I use into a DIY flowchart just to try and visualize the sound transitions. Just see at the top there, which is very challenging to try and visualize sound. So I use time codes and I use the switches from the screenshots of the film. And the second version of this remix ultimately escalated into a live performance with one of the students acting as a DJ. So it was a different dynamic and it was more structured. But interestingly, the first sort of spontaneous live scoring version resulted in more complex and unexpected outcomes than the premeditated version. Although in the second version, students had more time to reflect on their role within this sort of collective intelligence brainstorming paradigm. So this is just one sort of example to say that experimental and experiential pedagogy can result in very unexpected outcomes, but that's not necessarily counterproductive, and we should embrace this unpredictability because it can lead to new methodologies, to more sort of communication and collaboration between instructors and students, and of course to some unpredictable pedagogical insights about our age of distracted attention.
Okay, hi everybody. I'm coming at this from the perspective of art history, which, unlike these last two wonderful demonstrations, which are just leaving my head spinning, is more silent and slightly more static. So I want to begin with a photo of a bunch of kids in the Rijksmuseum in the Netherlands looking at their phones instead of at Rembrandt's Night Watch, which went viral a couple of years ago. Many hundreds of people tweeted and retweeted this image, calling it a metaphor of the times and so on and so forth. Anyway, we generally assume that the act of looking down at a phone instead of your surroundings shows a surrender to distraction, and that distraction is generally a bad thing. And these are issues that Marion brought up in her introduction. We think about this particularly, of course, if we're managing meetings, or if we're educators, or especially if we're the parents of teenagers. I am all three of these. Anyway, I'm going to get back to these Dutch kids later. But in fact, looking down at your phone is, along with the subterranean communication that is social media, a way of connecting actively and privately with the larger world of ideas expressed in your surroundings. This may seem obvious, but that larger world can be harnessed for teaching, as if the phones were, in a sense, extensions of our brains. So when I teach art history, for example, I have an idea of the history of art in my head, a mental landscape which has been evolving over the 30+ years I've been involved in the study and teaching of art. So my job is to give students their personal, private access to that landscape in my head as it's currently represented in digital form. The entire history of art as we know it, or much of it anyway, which the students can hold in their hands and play with. Their view into the virtual, or as André Malraux put it, imaginary museum, is what I've been trying to exploit in my teaching. And that's why I call my ongoing pedagogical project in art history the Imaginary Museum. musée imaginaire. Sorry. So teachers of art history have the challenge of educating students about physical objects that generally aren't immediately accessible except in reproduced form. The traditional model of art history instruction involves lecturing or discussion and communal viewing oriented towards a single location. Once upon a time with mounted photographs, and then slides, and now with digital presentation. And this is, on the whole, a workable system. The problem, of course, is that despite the ability of students to take notes directly on their laptops, like the young women on the left-hand side, the main image is still on a static screen. So the students, these are actually AP students, so the kids in the picture on the right have to get up and go to the front of the room to be able to look closely at the image. So for several years now, I've been experimenting with breaking free of this instructional format in my classes. So I'm demonstrating a few strategies I've developed with what I call portable digital technology, which includes laptops, tablets, and phones. And I say portable because I want to distinguish that from mobile, which has to do with a different type of software. But as far as I'm concerned, if you can hold it and walk around with it, then it's portable, regardless of how big the screen is. Anyway, I've been using these strategies to help my art history students learn to be active viewers and collaborators. I not only invite, but require them to use their personal technologies for individual and group work. And this is just a picture from my classroom. And as you see, the lights are on. And the windows are up, and they're all, I put them into little groups, and they're working in these groups on a project. And I should also add that they're looking up and smiling at me because I also use my phone to take attendance. So rather than only seeing the traditional art history canon, the objects most commonly found, say, in a typical art history survey, the students can almost instantly see many, many other examples of every type of art and integrate these objects into a much larger understanding of how the production of art might function in a particular society. So just in this particular case, I'm looking over the shoulder of a student when I had told them to do a general search for 19th century landscape. And so you can see a whole bunch of images all at the same time, which may seem pretty ordinary to us now, but to anybody having to struggle with the limits of what you can do in an art history classroom, say 30 years ago, it's phenomenal that, that students can do this. So here, for example, is another way of using this technology. This is my class taking an exam. So since the classroom technology, that sort of crummy screen at the front, malfunctioned as it typically does, right in class I emailed them the PowerPoint that I was trying to show them and had them write their answers on paper, in effect turning the communal image test into a private experience with the objects in front of them. So the students were providing themselves with the images rather than depending on me. And so of course you see that nice empty podium at the front because I'm not there, I'm standing at the back of the room. The art history survey is a particular challenge given the volume of information and the large class size. I have about 40 students in these classes. I tend to give students a core group of objects using ArtStore, our digital image database, and I make sure they understand that this is a sampling, not all there is. So here is a sample little image group for 18th century art and architecture, very typical. And then here is what happens when you select one particular image, in this case, a painting by Watteau. So then the students can do this on their own screens, and then they can contextualize these core sample objects by doing further searches. They can see right away what the rest of Watteau's work looks like. They have the whole internet to play with to see a multiplicity of objects. So instead of my having to show them a whole lot of stuff, I spend the time asking questions, helping them find images, moving all over the classroom. So here's another example of using several types of technology at once. So I have up on the screen this time, very faintly, is Van Gogh's Starry Night, and I put it up there, and next to it on the whiteboard, very hard to see, are some spontaneous notes I had written based on their impressions about, pardon the pun, sorry, about Impressionism. And then I asked the students to do a quick image search for 18th century landscapes so they could see how a traditional formula for landscape painting looked for the century before Van Gogh. So that's what you're seeing, all those students pulling up on their own screens. I also have students use their own screens to work together, as I mentioned. And here you can see some students working with phones and screens together. Every couple of weeks, I give the students brief in-class collaborative projects in groups of 2 or 3. They usually need to solve some kind of problem or explore a theme. So this is just an example. This was on the first day of class about 3 weeks ago. Finding examples of works in several different media. This is for a survey class, and it's Renaissance art. Posting an image onto a voice thread and then adding their names. Just a very simple thing so that they could learn how to do it. So this is what they made. In effect, as I've said here, a crowdsourced, collaborative, almost like a museum exhibit using VoiceThread. The groups reported on their findings, essentially learning on their own what I could have shown them on a communal screen, but in a presentation they have created for themselves, which we can all share together, and then which got saved to their course website so they could look at it over and over. In effect, they were creating content, knowledge content for their own class. So it's virtual and it's imaginary, like the Museum Without Walls or Musée Imaginaire, but it offers the realities of art to students. So how do we make a classroom more like a museum, which involves roaming around and going up to art objects? In other words, freedom of movement, because that is one thing that you don't tend to have when you're sitting in a classroom. Many museums, of course, these days, in their continuing mission of outreach and education, are exploiting phone and tablet use, creating dedicated mobile apps to move beyond the wall label. So, were these kids at the Rijksmuseum using a museum app? According to a story in the Telegraph from a few months ago, quote, Twitter users have once again been sharing the image believed to have been taken in 2014, sparking a debate about what the children were actually doing. But the photographer of this scene, Gijsbert van der Waal, wrote, quote, some people asserted that the students were in fact attentive to the artworks using the museum's freely downloadable multimedia tour. That seems a plausible explanation. However, I think a well-designed museum app should continuously direct the attention of the user from the phone to the actual objects on display. I thought that was pretty good. So point taken. So recently, I was lucky enough to be able to teach a class entirely at the Metropolitan Museum, extremely difficult logistically for a Long Island campus. So it may be my only time, we'll see, where students used their portable devices to contextualize the objects they encountered. We met once a week at the Met for 3 hours. So here they are, starting out their class in the school groups area in the Uris Center for Education. They're reading through the assignment for the day, and they've gone into Blackboard on their phones, and they've downloaded the assignment. So here they are, So here they are actually looking at some works of art, and it's a little hard to see here, but on the bottom, a group of them are actually standing around a couple of objects. You can't see because that's sort of where I'm standing to take this picture of them. And so some of them have their phones, and a couple of them have notebooks. So they were using both technologies to look at what they had to do. I gave them an assignment where they had to go around and find a bunch of objects and that were connected in certain thematic ways, and then they could choose how they wanted to put them together. And so now here they are in the American wing, and they look as if they're just sitting there ignoring all the nice sculptures in the American wing, but in fact, they were working on their so-called in-class discussion, which again would be made into a voice thread and posted to the class website. So there they are on their phones, and here is one student who's he let me take a picture of him over his shoulder, and he's about to upload that to his to the voice thread. Then here they are in Nolan Library, where they went to do research for their final projects, where they had to put together a kind of virtual exhibit, and they worked in pairs. This is a very common final project now in art history classes. And so here they used books and periodicals as well as online sources, and they really loved this part, and they were very comfortable moving between traditional and newer technologies in the course of their 2 different visits to the library. And I should add that they were really excited because I took their pictures and I made them signed release forms and everything, and I said, I'm going to be talking about you guys in a talk, and they were just beyond thrilled. So they're delighted to have their images up here, in case anybody's wondering. Oops. That's okay, I don't need it anymore. Anyway, so I don't really have anything brilliant to sum up with here, except to recapitulate that there are so many ways in which portable digital visual technology can be used to turn the classroom into a much more collaborative and dynamic space than anyone could have thought possible, even say 15 years ago. So that's it. Thank you.
So I'm an NYU alum. I earned my doctorate here in 1998, studying with Robert Ramo. Originally I'm a Chaucerian, trained in medieval studies, and now I teach writing studies. And I think that part of the thesis of what I'm going to show you here is that there's a lot in common between what we do in distracted reading kinds of conversations and with those kinds of conversations that had to do with the change from orality to literacy. So my recent research is entitled When the Essay is the Gloss. So when the marginalia, when the commentary outside the text at the center becomes more important than the thing at the center. Okay, so that's what annotation is to me. So I'm going to make a case then for distracted reading, and I'm going to do this by just talking about one of the small assignments that I do in my first year writing classes. And I'm sure that many of you teach writing in whatever discipline that you're in. So I'm hoping that this will be relevant to you. Okay, so art history. Camille Pissarro, Les Trois Rouges, Coins de Village, et Faits divers. All right, what does that mean? That means that this is an Impressionist painting, right, obviously. And here it's titled those red roofs at the corner of the village trending towards winter. And so you get this impression of what writing looks like for these students and what thinking looks like, and I think it has a lot to do with the margins of things, the in-between state. So keep that image in your mind. Let's see if their annotations make an impression. All right, well, what is reading anyway? Think, if you can, think of a manuscript. Think of a manuscript in the first stages of English literacy, an undecorated, non-illuminated manuscript. Think of the Ugly Beowulf manuscript, right? Not scanned, no attention to imagery, not even clean margins, right? Just written from one side of the page to the other. I remember Professor Ramo telling us years ago that when a medieval person wanted to write anything, the first thing that he had to do was kill a sheep. Right? And you know, when you think of how bloody the act of writing originally was and how sacred reading became as a result, right? It will change, I think, your reaction to these things. Jump forward now to where we are. We don't have to kill a sheep. We can write on anything. We write on our bodies, right? We write on our clothing. We purchase writing, right? We're reading or we're not reading all the time. And so all of these kinds of reading, all these particular kinds of reading enact and require particular habits of mind. Welcome to my classroom. First-year students who have to take 2 compulsory writing courses. They're not happy to be there. They think that they can write a 5-page essay in 1.34 hours, right? And so I have to teach them first to be a reader. I have to teach them next to be a writer, and then to be a rereader of texts. Jerome McGann has this very interesting notion about what reading is for us, right? Those of us on the other side, right? Radial reading, that's the kind of reading we do. We read, we make, and we remake knowledge. We read footnotes. We consider images. We look for what citations do. We acknowledge sources, right? But first-year writers don't do any of those things. So radial reading, McGann explains, creates a kind of plasticity to the text that is unique according to each reader, right? So that's what I need to enact for my students or to approximate. So I met up with some wonderful programmers at MIT, and the program that I'm using is Annotation Studio. But you can do this with any kind of digital annotation program, so please don't think that I'm advocating for that project. In fact, we're going to hear about some more in a little while. So think then of digital annotation not as Annotation Studio, although that's what I'll be talking about. Think of it as reading collaboratively, reading with other people, and then certainly as leaving a kind of a trace. Reading, remember, it was awkward to find yourself, if you were medieval, to be reading quietly and silently. You always read with an audience because the oral tradition, when it moved to literate practices and thought of audiences, but we don't think of that, right? So think then, to situate your mind here, think then of reading as a spectacle. Think of reading as a performance, and most of all, think of it as a kind of a conversation. You need to know a little bit about how I designed this course. There's a lot of stuff. So what I did to make sure that I don't miss anything, I made a quick screencast, then I put all of these things on a web page for you. So if you're interested, you can look at it again. This is one of my course blogs. It is for the first semester of college writing, and the theme is what counts as writing. And so I'm going to play it for you and talk about the features of the course blog, and then you'll see on the side how all of the students in my classes are collaborating across classes. So there are some 40 students listed with independent blogs on the side. Well, let me show it to you. I think, oh, yeah, sure. Thank you. Okay, so here's the course blog, and I'm scrolling through. The first homework that I'm going to ask them to do, I'll read it to you. It says, make an account on Annotation Studio because we're going to be annotating. And then think about the kinds of things, after you do annotate this short essay, think about the kinds of things that you're annotating, the kinds of categories. You'll see on the right that those are the student blogs, links to all the blogs. So they're going to be annotating in this collaborative space. And then I give them assignments all through the semester. So every month they're doing 1 or 2 annotation assignments. At first, when they start annotating, they don't actually know what to do. With annotation, they do things like write, yes, I agree, and that's their comment. Or they just put a question mark, which is pretty useless in terms of returning. And then they learn how to categorize these annotations as they go along. And then they start to leave a trace. So you see the sunflower image there is very important on my blog heading, because there is the residue of the flower, right, as it loses its beauty, right? But I think it's actually even more beautiful as it scatters there, the pollen on the leaf. Now I'm going to take you into Annotation Studio. Again, this is difficult to do live, so I tried to make a screencast to show you this again, how it works, and then what students annotate. And I don't know if you can see the yellow highlighting very much, but I made one annotation, and then I'll take you through what it looks like, just so that you have a visual on how this is kind of like a glossed manuscript. Annotations are going to occur in 2 places in this program. Hovering over the text itself, and then in a long stream along the side. So let's see if we can approximate that. Sorry. There it is. So I can just look at my annotations by myself, or I can start to see the work of my peers and across classes, which is very interesting, I think, because these are people, they're annotating with people that they don't know. And then the full result, you'll see, this is a very short text that I'm exempling here. Lots of yellow, different shades of yellow, when more than one person annotates a spot. The column on the right is in chronological order, and then when we hover over the text, you'll see the conversations start to happen. Of course, you can't see much, but it's very interesting how they're evolving. And this one is fairly early in the term. You can see here at this finish that there are some 6 students actually discussing this portion of the text. And you could insert your discipline and your expertise there, and I think it would be very relevant. All right. So what characterizes, these are 4 pods, right? 4 groups of students in an active learning space, and 2 groups, two sessions come in. So pod 1 consists of students from both classes, as does 2, 3, and 4. And each one of these started to have their own characteristics. So I don't think I have time to show you these, but I can just tell you, pod 1 in the morning class, they were kind of not doing a great job. So their annotations, they annotated a lot of text, they highlighted a lot of text, but wrote very little. In the afternoon in pod 1, the opposite happened. So that enriched the experience of the morning class, certainly. Okay. In pod 2, they were highlighting very small sections of text and then writing a lot of text in both classes, and that kind of overwhelmed. So each one of these groups got their own sort of take on the situation. So what do they do? They do a lot of things, and I'd like to just jump out of this to show you the results of this study. There we go. So I took all of those assignments and then I coded them to see how they did by the end of the semester, and this is what I found. I grouped them into 5 different grades, and you can see the rubric here on the screen, or most of it. So they range from not explicit, they neglect to do the assignment, they don't actually attribute their peers. They were actually asked to go back in, right, to work with the annotations and include them in their writing sample for that week. And so in the not explicit means that they don't actually acknowledge any other writers, which is, not going to work for this kind of assignment. And then they go all the way up through expert. And so I'm trying to give the attributes here of what they've made. And then the breakdown at the bottom. I think it's really interesting that moving from not productive to completely productive, that there's this wonderful curve, right? Bell curve with the number of students being proficient at 11 in the middle and then tapering down. And this is after a semester long of teaching them how to annotate and to be and to work with those annotations. So one of the things that I've learned, and I think this actually works really well thinking back to our first speaker when we're talking about appropriation and repurposing, that they will learn, students learn how to use each other's language and learn how to use each other's ideas very, very successfully if you set these kinds of things in motion for them. So I think I'll leave it at that.
My collaborator, colleague, co-author, co-teacher, Martha Rust, could not be here this evening. And she's the primary author on this paper that we've done, and I've shortened it for the 10 minutes. So if you'll forgive me, I'm going to read it to do justice to her language. Towards the end of his autobiography, Speak Memory, Vladimir Nabokov writes, quote, "The spiral is a spiritualized circle. In the spiral form, the circle, uncoiled, unwound, has ceased to be vicious," unquote. While the circle encloses and the spiral opens out, as Nabokov goes on to explain, like an image of Hegel's thesis, antithesis leading to synthesis. Quote, "Twirl follows twirl, and every synthesis is the thesis of the next series," unquote. In this way, the transformative spiral becomes an image for the major periods of his life. Nabokov might also have confessed that the spiral provides a model for the pattern he adopts in telling the story of that life as well, a pattern that Beatrice Ibanez calls, quote, narrativity of displacement, characterized by the repetition and displacement of ostensibly insignificant details. This narrative strategy creates a looping or spiraling movement among moments of narrative understanding, and it is a technique Nabokov uses. Ibanez argues, quote, to imitate the workings of memory. Ibanez goes on to point out that Nabokov's picture of his life as a colored spiral in a glass ball is an excellent example of this narrative of displacement, imitating the working of memory, since it recycles and rearranges details from an earlier moment of self-awareness, when as a boy Nabokov glimpsed a rainbow emerging after a thunderstorm while standing inside a stained glass pavilion. Then he stood inside a colored glass structure, witnessing a colored arc. Now he sees his life as a series of colored arcs in a glass ball, which he now sees from the outside. Philip West adduces another metaphor for Nabokov's simulation of memory, the hologram. In essence, a hologram is produced through a technology of juxtaposed images, and in this way is similar to memory. For as West puts it, quote, "The life of memory involves visions and revisions many times over." In Speak Memory, Nabokov evokes his practice of superimposing images and thereby also juxtaposing narrative times in a metaphor that involves a Persian carpet. Quote, "I confess I do not believe in time. I like to fold my magic carpet after use. in such a way as to superimpose one part of the pattern over another. Let the visitors trip. For our course entitled What is Memory, which we have developed with the support of a grant from the NEH, we have designed a collaborative class project intended to support students' recognition both of Nabokov's play with metaphors and memory, and of the tendencies of their memories to constellate around images, objects, and metaphorical elaborations of the same. A marriage of methodology and technology, the project makes use of Gregory Ulmer's My Story mode of writing and a multimodal web authoring platform developed at the University of Southern California named Scalar. You're looking at that. Gregory Ulmer first articulated the concept of My Story in his 1989 book, Teletheory, Grammatology in the Age of Video, where he presented it as a heuristic mode of composition that approaches an object of study from the side of wanting to find out, unlike the traditional academic essay that is, quote, positioned on the side of the already known. In this way, My Story functions as a historiography of an individual's learning process, which in turn, in theory, supports learning how to learn. As Ulmer puts it, the Mystorian is not proving a case nor persuading an opponent, as if such an event were possible, but avowing the history of my own conversation or turn, of that which for me is counted as proof and pudding. Most of the book Teletheory is devoted to establishing the rationale for My Story as a postmodern remedy to traditional academic writing. But at the end, Ulmer provides an example of the genre, a My Story entitled Derrida at the Little Bighorn, which performs his learning Derridian theory in a montage of his Montana boyhood. He prefaces his story with an assignment he set himself, which for the purpose of this presentation can serve as a checklist of the My Story's genre's basic formal characteristic. Write a My Story bringing into relation your experience with three levels of discourse: personal, autobiography; popular, for example, community stories, oral history, or popular culture; and expert, disciplines of knowledge. In each case, use the punctum or sting of memory to locate items significant to you. Once located, research the representations of the popular and expert items in the collective archive, or encyclopedia, thus mixing living and artificial memories. Select for inclusion in your text fragments of this information most relevant to the items in your oral life story. Arrange the entries to highlight the chance associations that appear among the three levels. The salient point in this passage for an understanding of My Story is that it works at three levels of discourse: the personal, the popular, and the expert. For an understanding of how genre might be especially useful for students exploring memory, 2 points pertain. First, it activates and authorizes autobiographical memory and its associative quality as an appropriate tool for learning about something new. And second, it defamiliarizes the autobiographical by putting it into dialogue with collective memory and with disciplinary forms of knowledge. Nabokov's remarks on his life as a colored spiral in a small glass ball have a My Story-like quality, for they highlight the chance associations among his memory of standing in a stained glass window pavilion, an object of popular culture, a marble and philosophical discourse, Hegel's triad of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Ulmer first developed the My Story mode in his book Teletheory, but Martha and I first discovered it in an introduction to writing about literature called Textbook. In its iteration there, where it was presented specifically as a method for exploring a work of literature, My Story had several additional format requirements, which it borrowed from Roland Barthes' A Lover's Discourse. As before, My Story tells a personal story, but it now tells it in dialogue with a specific tutor text. Barthes' A Lover's Discourse models this process in that it tells the story of its narrator's failed love affair by appropriating and in a way riffing on selections from Goethe's Sorrows of Young Werther. In our course, we work on the My Story project for 4 weeks, which period encompasses the 3 weeks we spend reading Speak Memory, and a week more for students to tie up loose ends. The assignment sheet that students receive begins with this explanation of the project's purpose, and that's what I'm showing you here. This is our scalar book for the class. There, so you see that. I don't need to read it. And I've also brought handouts that have the assignment and 2 examples of the first My Story assignments. One by me and one by Martha, serving as a model. Sure, there's only 20, so if people didn't want it and didn't get it, that would be good. The assignment goes on to explain what a figure is and to give this example using Speak Memory. I want to point out only that we added the requirement that a quotation from Speak Memory must follow each figure's argument. For the first week of the project, students each write a figure with at least 1 body paragraph. They also add a paragraph to another student's figure. In subsequent weeks, they each write 2 more figures, 1 per week, and continue adding material to their classmates' figures, including 2 paragraphs that makes explicit use of scholarly material and 1 that is what we call a ghost memory. That is, a short recollection that could plausibly be inserted into Speak Memory, or a memory belonging to one of the characters in the memoir, one that he or she may have written in his or her memoir. And some of these were quite amusing, these ghost memories. For that paragraph, students were also asked to make use of an idea or metaphor for memory and to write a short commentary explaining their rationale in composing the memory and the idea or metaphor for memory that it employed. Although the assignment sounds complicated, the students had little difficulty with it, something I attribute partly to the fact that they were not only actively and personally engaged with the text, but with each other, creating, in a sense, a My Story for the class. For the final assignment in the course, students could choose among several options or propose one of their own. Among the options was to write their own My Story using literary or other work of their choice, 1 or more works of visual art or sculpture, or a combination of such works. Several of the students have chosen that option and created scalar books of their own, writing the stories of their families.
Thank you very much to all of our speakers and a wonderful array of ideas here. We have some time for questions before we move to the reception outside. So if anybody would like to, has a question they want to ask, please do so. It might help if I ask the first question just to give you some time, some little thinking time. And what I noticed about all of your presentations is they all seem to harness the idea of play, that there seems to be this strong sort of impetus behind what you're all doing to really think about the playfulness and bring back, in a sense, a kind of playfulness to the classroom, to the ways of thinking. And I wondered if any of you wanted to say a little bit more about play.
Well, the first one is a mere linguistic one, right? Because music, to play music and to play have the same word, but they also feel the same quality, the same nature, right? So when you are making music and you're left to do whatever you do, you are in effect playing. And that term has been used a lot in making music as a sort of a point of departure, right? You find something and then you play with it, and that's how you discover potentiality of material, right? So I mean, I don't know how that translates into the other domains that we've explored, but it's an interesting word for sure.
Well, as child development experts have long pointed out, play is learning for small children, and I don't really think that stops, despite the efforts of the educational system to stop it. I don't think it ever really does stop, and so I think that it is remarkable that we have all this in common, but in some ways not all that surprising, because if the idea is to take forms of technology that tend to make people, especially students in these cases, because these are pedagogical, to make them shut themselves out from their surroundings. In fact, all we're doing is sort of showing how these same technologies can let them connect with their surroundings in a different way. And I think what we're all trying to do is to rethink what learning is, what teaching is. And if it's about play, then so much the better.
So one of the essays that my students annotate is an essay by Jonathan Franzen called Farther Away, in which he chronicles his experience following the suicide of David Foster Wallace. And the students were annotating things like, why is he so obsessed with mule droppings? What is all this shit? And, you know, I was horrified. And then I watched what happened over the annotations, and they were really amazing, because then they started saying, well, maybe that's where he is. He's looking down. He's not looking up. He's thinking about excrement. What is this scatological references? And then they started researching all these things. So that moment, like, you know, in the classroom where you might have silenced that speaker, right, in an annotation space, in a collaborative reading space, the students permit things to happen, and then productive observations and important things happen. Because in fact, it's true, he mentions in a very short essay, mentions the mule droppings multiple times, which I think is, you know, a good catch, actually.
Any other questions for any or all of our panelists?
Hi, fascinating panel. I more or less have questions for everyone, but I'll just start off with Jaime, with the preface that there really isn't anything new under the sun, as Shakespeare said, right? So when you were describing this wonderful little device, I was thinking of the theremin, I think it's called. You know, I mean, that was like the 1920s, 30s, you know?
Yes.
Okay, so, I mean, just a little comment on that. And also, again, the idea of sometimes too much is no good, in terms of I know when I go online to search something, and I put in my question, and then it comes up, 4,344,624 in 0.15 seconds, and I have to make a choice as to which one I'm gonna, And my personality is I want to read them all so I can make the right choice. And I think it's also a generational kind of thing. We're used to looking at certain things, and I see people, stop at a corner, look on their iPhone to find out where they are, rather than looking up and looking at the building where they wanted to go to. So. But all this, I was thinking about this subject, before I came, and in terms of what's going to happen to the art of letter writing. I'm reminded of what happens, when you read the letters of Thomas Jefferson, or the letters of, in the future, people are not writing letters anymore. So how will the history of one's personal life, get lost in cyberspace? So. My major question is, what do you think is going to happen to the art of letter writing and personal histories?
Well, so for theremin, right? I mean, just about theremin, that is one of the first examples of people being captivated by electronic gesture and sound. And that is a model that I've studied a lot and that I didn't include because of time, but it's absolutely You're absolutely right. And he had a series of patent lawsuits because he had appropriated others. So there's indeed nothing new under the sun. And something that we were talking about of appropriation, of course, all of these are points of departure. It's not stealing, right? It's sort of in the open source spirit is finding something that fascinates you and using that as a point of departure. So theremin, absolutely theremin, but this is not a theremin, right? And like the things that appropriate things that I've done are not what I've done. They're distinct artworks and letters. No one about letters. Letter writing.
Not letter writing in particular, but just in general. I don't think that any medium is ever obsolete, whether it's in popular memory and its documentation, but I think that every medium becomes remediated or reincarnated in newer practices that, of course, are not quite the same as in the first medium, but we still see different writing traditions, not quite the same as letter writing, but other forms of sort of engaging with text.
Actually, I want to answer that. So I could make the case that the entire world archive of text messages is one gigantic letter from humanity, right? It's all back and forth, okay? Which makes it a lot more conversational. But in a sense, it's one big letter, right? Letters back then were conversational, but in paragraph form. Today's letters are conversational, but in 160 characters, or typically more. But in a sense, text messages and Facebook messages and, you know, back and forth messages that are very, very casual are a record of the archive of humanity. So if we save that and, you know, hundreds or thousands of years from now, they look back, they could actually recreate essentially how we lived based off of what we've written to each other over social media, over emails, text messages. It's the same thing. Like she said, it doesn't really go away. It morphs, but we still have the same stuff from 100 years ago.
I just want to give...
Marion, you could take one or two more questions
Yeah.
in a row, and then people could respond.
That's a good idea.
Okay.
Anybody else got a question?
Okay.
I don't know. Does anyone in the panel have experimented with virtual and augmented reality as a form of art and entertainment?
Okay.
Or anything?
And let's take a couple more, so we have them all. We'll just take all the questions. Anybody else? Yeah.
Okay, so I have a fairly dumb softball question. I essentially for the cinema and why even do this? What does a kind of collaborative reading do that you can't get somewhere else, other than like use technology, right? So like, how is technology not just doing cool stuff because everybody's doing really cool stuff, but why is it better or why can't it be better?
So to answer either of those two questions. But Marina, do you want to start with the augmented reality?
Okay. Yeah, so I'm teaching courses on interactive media, participatory cinema, and so forth. And so in addition to sort of historically exploring participation in cinema and sort of active spectatorship, I also like to incorporate sort of the latest technology, and we're looking at virtual reality, tracing it back to the traditions of the panorama and sort of different regimes of vision and tactile engagement with moving images. And then with augmented reality, we're using just some apps that are kind of, one is similar to the museum app or to the art history app. So, but just still experimenting. And then with virtual reality, we also sort of spontaneously brainstorm on new theories based on experiential exploration of virtual reality spaces. So just different.
So I like this question of why, because every time you add something new to a course, something else invariably gets pushed out, right? So you really do have to choose very, very carefully what you include, and not try to make something just the trend or what's useful. So I'll just back this up and reference very old text, Walter Ong's Orality and Literacy, and his mention of the fact that we are actually, the next thing we're going towards is a sequel of literacy, right? And so there's this, we know what orality is, we know what literacy is, but what happens when people are digitally literate, which is really what the sequel is. And so we're in this space. When I ask students, when I survey students and have them take pictures of their reading practices, they are invariably reading together, looking at someone's text message together. That's a picture. Or looking at Facebook reading comments or YouTube comments. And so there's this notion that they don't read alone. They're always reading with someone else, reading. That's a kind of a different performance. So I think in the history of reading is very interesting. You know, you move to the oral. You move from the oral tradition, which is around the campfire, where people gather, and the tale changes by the people who are in the room, by the audience in the room, and then to that very, very precious textual document, right, which then becomes very not precious in the age of newspaper, and less precious in the age of laser printed student essays that are very, very formulaic. So how do you get writing away from something that they don't understand, right, that they don't understand what knowledge is or what acknowledgement is, and the one way to, I think, to make them understand it is by meeting them where they are. They understand it. They have a different habit of mind. They have different ways that they process things. I'm staying away from all kinds of terms like digital natives and things like that. But there's a rewiring of the brain. So we do have to be attentive to this. You know, they don't do radial reading like we do radial reading, right? They're different, and maybe they're better off because they have access to all these kinds of things, equipment that we didn't, right?
So is your goal to get them to the point through different means they're doing radial reading, or is your goal to get a completely different kind of reading?
My goal is to understand what's happening, and I don't want to take up the whole question time, but to understand what's happening to reading so that I can teach them and lead them to textuality, because bottom line, writing is still going to endure past all of these medium, right? We just don't know where we're going to be writing it, probably in digital spaces, and so that's that's where I am.
What I've learned in experimenting with a variety of things, including social media, is that for me as the teacher, I have a much more intimate relationship with my students. I get to know them much better, and they get to know each other, and we become sort of a collaboratory in the classroom. And it's a very, very rich, very intensive work for me to stay on top of all that, this My Story project, for example, all the entries that they make and keeping track of all that. But the feeling of closeness to the students just can't be beat.
I think this is a really good question on which to move this into a more informal discussion over food and drink and all kinds of things that are just beyond these doors. So I'd like to thank all of our speakers one last time.